Dawn breaks over Hiroshima. August 6th, 1945. 5:30 a.m. The city wakes slowly. Streetcars hum along their rails. Shopkeepers slide wooden doors open. Children walk barefoot across dusty alleys, lunch tins swinging at their sides. Above them, the sky is clear. A flawless summer blue. At 8:15 a.m., the light arrives. Not fire, not flame. A white silence. For a fraction of a second, the city exists twice. Once in shadow, once in vapor. Concrete blisters. Glass becomes sand. Human figures are burned into stone walls where they stood, waiting for trams that will never come. Then, the sound arrives. A pressure wave that crushes lungs and collapses roofs in a single violent breath. Buildings fold inward, bridges twist. Rivers surge with bodies and debris. Those who survive the blast emerge slowly from the ruins. Their clothes are gone. Skin hangs in strips, eyes swollen shut. They walk without screaming, not because they feel no pain, but because the shock is too deep for sound. Cameras will later capture these survivors. Charred silhouettes, burned faces, bandaged children staring into nothing. And behind every image lies a story that began long before this morning. A story that now pulls us backward. To the forces, decisions, and fears that led humanity to this moment. By the summer of 1945, the world had already been burning for nearly 6 years. Europe lay in ruins. Berlin had fallen in May. Adolf Hitler was dead. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. But the war was not over. In the Pacific, it continued with relentless violence. Japan still fought. Across Asia and the Pacific Islands, Imperial Japanese forces remained entrenched, from Burma to the Philippines, from China to Okinawa. Their doctrine emphasized endurance, sacrifice, and refusal to surrender. American planners knew what that meant. Every mile forward came at extraordinary cost. The Battle of Iwo Jima, February 1945. Nearly 7,000 American dead. Over 20,000 Japanese defenders killed. The Battle of Okinawa, April to June 1945. More than 12,000 American dead. An estimated 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed. Tens of thousands of civilians caught between artillery and suicide charges. Entire families jumped from cliffs rather than be captured. These battles terrified Allied leadership. They were previews of what an invasion of mainland Japan might become. Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion, was projected to be the largest amphibious assault in history. U.S. military estimates varied widely. Conservative projections anticipated hundreds of thousands of casualties. Some internal studies suggested over 1 million Allied casualties if Japan resisted fully. Meanwhile, Japan itself was collapsing. American B-29 bombers were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9, 1945, killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Wooden neighborhoods vanished in seas of flame. Similar raids followed across Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of regional cities. Yet the Japanese government did not surrender. Inside Tokyo, political paralysis ruled. Civilian leaders sought mediation through the Soviet Union. Military hardliners demanded continued resistance. The emperor remained silent in public, bound by tradition and political constraint. While Japan burned, another project unfolded in secrecy. The Manhattan Project. Authorized in 1942 after fears that Nazi Germany might develop nuclear weapons first, the project became the largest scientific industrial effort in history. Over 130,000 workers, facilities spread across Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and dozens of hidden sites. Billions of dollars poured into uranium enrichment and plutonium production. Physicists raced against time. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed weapons design. Enrico Fermi perfected reactor technology. Engineers struggled to shape an explosion that had never existed before. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the test code-named Trinity took place. At 5:29 a.m., the first atomic bomb detonated. Observers described the blast as brighter than the sun. The shockwave rattled windows 120 miles away. Mushroom clouds climbed into the upper atmosphere. Scientists stared in silence. Some cheered. Others felt immediate dread. The weapon worked. Days later, President Harry S. Truman was informed while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany. There, Allied leaders finalized post-war arrangements. The bomb instantly altered negotiations. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The statement warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. Tokyo did not respond. Inside Japan's leadership circles, the declaration was debated. Military commanders rejected surrender terms that eliminated the emperor's political authority. Newspapers used the word mokusatsu to withhold comment, which foreign translators interpreted as outright rejection. Time ran out. American military planners had already selected targets. They wanted cities that were militarily significant, psychologically impactful, and relatively undamaged. Places where the bomb's effect could be measured clearly. Hiroshima stood high on the list. It was a major military logistics hub. Headquarters of the Japanese Second Army operated there. Troop movements flowed through its rail yards and ports. The city had been largely spared conventional bombing, making it a clean target for assessment. By early August, the bomb was ready. A uranium-based weapon nicknamed Little Boy was assembled on Tinian Island in the Mariana Chain. Air crews trained in silence. Security was extreme. Even many participants did not know the nature of the payload. Weather forecasts were checked constantly. August 6th offered clear skies over Hiroshima. In the early hours of that morning, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off the runway. Its destination lay 1,500 miles away. And beneath its flight path, an unsuspecting city prepared for another ordinary summer day. A day that would soon produce some of the most haunting photographs in human history. Hiroshima was not a city of factories and smokestacks. It was a city of water and bridges. 6 rivers divided its neighborhoods into islands of wooden homes, schools, street markets, temples, and military offices. Nearly 350,000 people lived there in the summer of 1945. Refugees from bombed cities had swollen its population. Families crowded into shared houses. Students were mobilized to clear fire breaks, tearing down old structures to prevent future firestorms. Despite the war, daily life continued. Women queued for rationed rice. Children attended shortened school days. Factory workers assembled uniforms and ammunition parts. Soldiers passed through the rail station on their way to southern fronts. Hiroshima's citizens had experienced air raid warnings before. American reconnaissance aircraft frequently flew overhead, but major bombing raids never came. Over time, residents grew accustomed to the sirens. Many stopped seeking shelter. This false sense of safety would prove fatal. On the island of Tinian, the mission plan was finalized. Colonel Paul Tibbets commanded the operation. The Enola Gay carried Little Boy in its bomb bay. 2 additional aircraft followed. One to measure blast effects, another to photograph the explosion. At 2:45 a.m., the planes departed. Fuel tanks were heavy. The bomb weighed over 9,700 pounds. Crew members were briefed to expect a blinding flash and severe turbulence after release. They were instructed to turn sharply away immediately following the drop. At 7:09 a.m., Hiroshima's air raid sirens sounded briefly. 3 American planes appeared on radar. Because the formation was small, Japanese air defense controllers classified it as a reconnaissance flight. The warning was canceled. Citizens returned to work. Streetcars resumed their routes. At 8:09 a.m., the Enola Gay reached its final approach. Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee locked the Norden bomb site onto the IOE bridge, a T-shaped landmark at the city center. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, the bomb was released. It fell for 43 seconds. At approximately 580 meters above ground, Little Boy detonated. The explosion unleashed energy equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at the hypocenter exceeded several thousand degrees Celsius. Air expanded violently. A pressure wave raced outward at supersonic speed. Within 1 second, everything within a radius of 1 mile was flattened. Wooden houses collapsed instantly. Brick structures shattered. Concrete buildings cracked and twisted. Human bodies were burned where they stood. Some were vaporized entirely. The blast ignited hundreds of fires simultaneously. Hiroshima became a firestorm. Winds rushed inward toward the center of destruction, feeding the flames. Oxygen was sucked from the air. Survivors struggled to breathe. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath rolling black smoke. Radiation, invisible, silent, poorly understood, began penetrating the bodies of those who lived through the blast. Gamma rays and neutron radiation damaged cells at the molecular level. Many would appear uninjured at first, only to collapse days later. Communication lines were severed. Tokyo did not immediately know what had happened. Military command centers lost contact with Hiroshima. Pilots sent confused reports describing a massive explosion and rising cloud visible from hundreds of miles away. By the afternoon, reconnaissance flights confirmed the truth. The city was gone. Yet amid the devastation, survivors began to move. They crawled from collapsed homes. They staggered along riverbanks. They gathered in schoolyards and open fields, seeking water and shade. And some of them were photographed. Japanese military photographers, medical documentation teams, foreign journalists arriving weeks later. Their images would become permanent evidence of what atomic warfare did to the human body. Faces blistered by flash burns, skin patterned with kimono fabric shadows, children with bandaged eyes, elderly women carrying burned grandchildren. Each photograph froze a moment of unimaginable trauma. And behind each frozen moment stood individual lives, shaped by fear, confusion, and the instinct to survive. To understand those images fully, we must now step closer to the people themselves, closer to the angles that reveal how this single morning reshaped war, medicine, leadership, and human memory. The first thing survivors remembered was not sound. It was light. A flash so intense, it penetrated closed eyelids. So bright, it erased shadows by burning them into walls. People kilometers from the center described it as standing inside the sun. Those closest to the hypocenter never screamed. They disappeared. Within a radius of several hundred meters, temperatures reached levels that ignited clothing instantly and charred skin in fractions of a second. Human silhouettes remained on stone steps and bridge surfaces, carbonized outlines marking where people had been waiting for streetcars or resting in the morning heat. Farther out, the damage was slower, crueler. Flash burns appeared in sharp patterns. Dark kimono fabric absorbed heat, while lighter cloth reflected it. Survivors emerged with floral burn designs etched permanently into their skin. Others suffered keloid scars, thick, raised tissue that grew months later as damaged cells healed improperly. Radiation sickness followed. Hair fell out in clumps, gums bled, purple bruises formed under the skin. Victims vomited uncontrollably. Many believed they had been poisoned. Doctors were overwhelmed. Hospitals had collapsed. Medical staff were dead or injured. Supplies were gone. Wounded civilians lay on school floors and temple grounds, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without clean water. Photographs captured faces swollen beyond recognition. Children whose eyelashes were burned away. Mothers with bandaged hands clutching infants who would not wake. Elderly men staring forward, silent, eyes hollow. These were not battlefield casualties. They were civilians, families who had never held weapons, now carrying wounds no previous war had created. Their suffering became the first human record of nuclear warfare. But the devastation did not stop with flesh and bone. It reshaped the very structure of the city itself. Hiroshima was not chosen randomly. Military planners wanted measurable destruction. The city's flat river basin allowed shock waves to travel efficiently. Its dense wooden neighborhoods created ideal fire conditions. Its military headquarters made it a legitimate strategic target that was wartime standards. After the blast, reconnaissance images revealed a nearly perfect, circular destruction pattern. At the center lay the hypocenter, beneath what became known as the atomic bomb dome. Within 1 mile, over 90% of buildings were destroyed or severely damaged. Rail lines twisted, bridges collapsed, roads disappeared under debris and ash. Some reinforced concrete structures remained standing. Skeletal shells stripped of windows and interiors. These ruins became silent monuments to the blast's geometry. Water infrastructure failed. Pipes ruptured. Fire hydrants were useless. Survivors crawled to rivers for relief. Thousands drowned when weakened bodies collapsed into the water. Photographs taken weeks later show endless fields of rubble. No skyline, no landmarks, just scorched earth and broken stone stretching to the horizon. Hiroshima became a laboratory of destruction. American analysts studied blast radii, thermal effect, and building collapse patterns. These findings shaped future nuclear weapons development and Cold War civil defense planning. The city itself became data. But behind the statistics stood individuals who tried to organize survival. And among them were leaders forced to make impossible decisions. In Tokyo, confusion reigned. Initial reports described a massive explosion. Communication lines were severed. No one understood the mechanism. Some military officials suspected a new weapon. Others believed it was a fuel depot explosion or conventional bombing amplified by firestorms. It took nearly 12 hours for the Imperial General Headquarters to grasp the scale. Meanwhile, Hiroshima's local government ceased functioning. Police stations burned. City officials were killed. Survivors improvised authority. Teachers organized first aid stations. Buddhist monks provided shelter. Military units attempted crowd control while searching for survivors. Inside the Imperial Palace, debate intensified. Hardliners still demanded resistance. They argued that one destroyed city did not change the strategic situation. They believed the United States possessed only one such weapon. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Only then did Emperor Hirohito intervene directly. On August 15th, he addressed the nation by radio, the first time Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb and the need to endure the unendurable. For many Hiroshima survivors, the surrender brought relief. For others, it brought anger. They felt sacrificed by leaders who delayed peace until catastrophe forced their hand. Yet leadership decisions were only part of the story, because the bomb also created a new battlefield inside the human body, one fought by doctors, scientists, and survivors who did not understand what they were facing. And that battle would define nuclear medicine forever. Hiroshima's doctors faced something no textbook had prepared them for. Patients arrived with burns that did not behave like ordinary fire injuries. Wounds that seemed minor suddenly worsened. Fevers spiked without infection. Blood counts collapsed. Internal bleeding appeared with no visible cause. At first, many physicians believed the illness came from smoke inhalation or chemical poisoning. They were wrong. What they were witnessing was acute radiation syndrome. Gamma radiation had damaged bone marrow. White blood cells disappeared. Immune systems collapsed. The body lost its ability to fight even minor infections. Victims who survived the blast often died weeks later. Hair loss became a visible warning sign. Survivors described waking up to find pillows covered in clumps of black hair, purple spots, petechiae spread across arms and legs. Gums bled spontaneously. Hospitals improvised treatments. They used salt water to clean wounds, rice paper for bandages, herbal remedies when pharmaceuticals were unavailable. Some doctors recorded symptoms carefully, not knowing they were creating the world's first radiation injury case studies. American medical teams arrived weeks later. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission was established to study long-term health effects. Blood samples were taken, physical examinations conducted. Survivors were photographed repeatedly, their scars becoming scientific data. For many hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, this felt invasive. They were studied, but not always treated. Yet this grim research created foundations for modern radiation oncology, nuclear safety protocols, and disaster medicine. Knowledge paid for with human suffering. But the bomb's impact was not limited to bodies and hospitals. It reshaped global power. Hiroshima was not only an attack on a city. It was a demonstration. The United States wanted to end the war quickly, but it also wanted to send a signal to every major power, especially the Soviet Union. The mushroom cloud carried political meaning. It announced that a new era had begun, an era where entire cities could be erased by a single aircraft. Photographs of Hiroshima circulated internationally. Governments studied them carefully. Military planners rewrote doctrines. Scientists raced to replicate the technology. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The Cold War nuclear arms race was born from the ruins of Hiroshima. What began as a wartime weapon became a permanent feature of global strategy. Mutually assured destruction. Deterrence through terror. The survivors of Hiroshima did not choose this role, but their suffering became the foundation of nuclear geopolitics. And while politicians debated power, survivors faced another battle, one against stigma. In post-war Japan, hibakusha faced discrimination. Employers feared radiation sickness was contagious. Families worried about genetic damage. Marriage proposals were withdrawn. Children of survivors were sometimes bullied. Many hid their past. They covered scars with long sleeves, avoided medical registration, refused interviews. Photographs that showed their injuries became both evidence and burden. Some survivors later chose to speak publicly. They described the heat, the silence after the blast, the rivers filled with bodies, the smell of burned flesh. Their testimonies transformed Hiroshima from a military statistic into a moral warning. Monuments were built, peace parks established, annual ceremonies held every August 6th at 8:15 a.m. Bells ring. Names are read. Silence falls. The world remembers. But remembrance did not begin with monuments. It began with the moment the bomb detonated, with the flash, with the rising cloud, with a point in time where everything changed. And that moment now demands our full attention, because what followed was not instant resolution. It was chaos, fire, suffering, and survival in the ruins. The true climax of Hiroshima's story. At 8:16 a.m., Hiroshima no longer existed as a functioning city. What remained was motion. Fire spread in every direction. Winds howled toward the center of destruction. The air itself seemed to burn. Survivors stumbled through streets that no longer had names, surrounded by collapsed homes and bodies buried beneath splintered wood. Those who could walk moved instinctively toward the rivers. Water meant life. Thousands gathered along the banks of the Ota River and its tributaries. Some crawled on hands and knees. Others carried family members whose skin peeled away when touched. Parents searched for children. Children cried for mothers who would never answer. Eyewitness accounts described scenes that defied comprehension. People with burned faces asked calmly for water. Soldiers whose uniforms had melted into their skin sat quietly against walls, too weak to move. A young girl wandered through the ruins holding a charred lunchbox, calling her brother's name again and again. Fires merged into a single massive inferno. By noon, a firestorm consumed much of the city center. Temperatures rose further. Oxygen vanished. Those trapped in collapsed shelters suffocated without flames ever touching them. Emergency response collapsed immediately. Police stations were destroyed. Fire brigades were wiped out. Hospitals were reduced to ruins. Doctors operated outdoors on wooden boards, amputating crushed limbs without anesthesia. Some survivors attempted to return home. They found nothing. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Streets had become fields of ash. Familiar landmarks vanished. People stood where their houses once stood, unable to understand what they were seeing. By mid-afternoon, a strange rain began to fall. Black droplets mixed with ash and radioactive particles descended from the mushroom cloud. Survivors later called it black rain. It stained clothing and skin. Many drank it unknowingly, desperate for water. Radiation exposure increased. But no one knew. No warning signs existed. No protective measures. No understanding of invisible contamination. As night approached, fires still burned. The city glowed red against the dark sky. Moans echoed from collapsed buildings. Survivors called out for help that would never arrive. Some begged strangers to carry them to water. Others lay quietly, accepting death. Japanese military units from nearby areas finally reached the outskirts. They were unprepared. Soldiers described stepping into a landscape of ruins so complete it felt unreal. The smell of burned flesh filled the air. Bodies lay stacked along roads where survivors had collapsed from exhaustion. They began rescue operations with bare hands, digging through debris, pulling out survivors who often died moments later. The scale of destruction overwhelmed every effort. By midnight, tens of thousands were already dead. And yet, the true impact of the bomb was still unfolding. Because the weapon did not stop killing when the fire died. It continued inside the blood, inside the bone marrow, inside the cells of those who believed they had survived. And as the first day ended, a second disaster quietly began. One that would claim lives without explosions, without flames, without warning. 3 days passed. From August 7th to August 9th, Hiroshima entered a second phase of catastrophe. The fires had burned themselves out, smoke thinned, the ruined city lay silent beneath the sun. At first glance, the worst seemed over. It was not. Survivors who had escaped with minor injuries began collapsing. Young men with no visible wounds developed high fevers. Women who had walked miles after the blast suddenly vomited blood. Children complained of dizziness, then lost consciousness. Doctors were confused. There were no burns, no shrapnel wounds, no infection to explain the symptoms. Yet patients continued dying. Autopsies revealed internal hemorrhaging, bone marrow destruction, severe organ damage. But the cause remained invisible. Radiation sickness was claiming its victims. Within 2 weeks, thousands more died, not from trauma, but from cellular collapse. The death toll climbed rapidly. Estimates vary, but by the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people in Hiroshima had died from the bomb and its effects, some instantly, some slowly, some months later. The city became a vast hospital. Schools became wards, temples became morgues, parks became burial grounds. Cremation fires burned day and night to prevent disease. Survivors wandered among the dead, searching for relatives. Many never found them. Identification was impossible. Bodies were burned beyond recognition. Family registries were destroyed. Entire households vanished. Meanwhile, news of Hiroshima spread. On August 9th, before the world could fully process the first atomic bombing, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The pattern repeated. Destruction, fire, radiation. That same day, Soviet forces invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, shattering Japan's last diplomatic hopes. The pressure became unbearable. On August 14th, Japan accepted Allied surrender terms. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the nation. The war ended, but for Hiroshima, peace did not arrive with celebration. There were no victory parades, no cheering crowds, only silence, only ruins, only survivors trying to understand what had happened to their city and their bodies. American occupation forces entered Hiroshima weeks later. They documented damage. They photographed survivors. They measured radiation levels. Some images were classified. Others slowly reached the public. They showed burned children, skeletal buildings, scarred faces. The world saw nuclear war not as a mushroom cloud, but as human suffering. These images became historical turning points. They reshaped global debates on warfare ethics, nuclear disarmament, and civilian protection. They transformed Hiroshima from a battlefield into a symbol. But symbols do not erase trauma. The survivors carried the weight of this moment for decades. Their lives unfolded in the long shadow of that morning. And the consequences of August 6th did not end in 1945. They rippled forward through politics, science, memory, and global fear. Which brings us to what came after the smoke cleared. The long aftermath, the rebuilding, the scars that never fully healed. When the fires finally died, Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was a flattened basin of ash and broken stone. From the air, the destruction looked surgical in its precision. A dark circular wound carved into the earth. At ground level, it was chaos. Twisted metal lay tangled with roof tiles. Street signs pointed nowhere. The smell of smoke and decay lingered for weeks. Survivors returned slowly. Some walked in from neighboring towns. Others emerged from makeshift shelters. Many carried nothing but the clothes they wore on August 6th. They searched for homes that no longer existed, standing on empty foundations, trying to remember where walls once stood. The Japanese government faced an unprecedented crisis. Transportation networks were destroyed. Food distribution collapsed. Clean water was scarce. Disease threatened to spread among displaced populations. Emergency reconstruction teams arrived. Temporary housing was built using scrap wood and salvaged materials. Barrack-style shelters rose on the outskirts of the ruins. Families crowded into single rooms. Privacy vanished. Grief was shared openly because there was nowhere to hide it. The dead were buried in mass graves. Priests conducted ceremonies without names. Ashes were placed into communal memorials. Families who never found remains placed empty urns on household altars, honoring relatives whose bodies had vanished completely. Radiation effects continued. Leukemia cases began appearing within years. Thyroid disorders increased. Birth defects and miscarriages rose among exposed populations. Doctors struggled to separate wartime malnutrition from radiation damage, but patterns became impossible to ignore. Survivors were forced to adapt. Many could no longer perform physical labor due to chronic pain and weakness. Scar tissue restricted movement. Some lost eyesight. Others suffered from constant infections caused by damaged immune systems. Employment became difficult. Factories hesitated to hire hibakusha. Fear of long-term illness made companies wary. Some survivors hid their medical histories to survive economically. Yet Hiroshima refused to remain a graveyard. Construction began slowly. By the late 1940s, new schools opened. Tram lines were rebuilt. Markets returned to central streets. Children were born in temporary clinics. Life crept back into the ruins. One structure remained untouched intentionally. The skeletal remains of the Industrial Promotion Hall, later called the Atomic Bomb Dome, were preserved as a reminder. Its shattered frame stood at the hypocenter, a permanent witness to the moment of destruction. Around it, the Peace Memorial Park took shape. Trees were planted, monuments erected, museums constructed. Survivors donated personal belongings. Burned clothing, melted glass, broken watches stopped at 8:15. The city transformed tragedy into memory. But rebuilding did not erase the psychological wounds. Because Hiroshima's survivors did not simply rebuild homes. They rebuilt identity. They rebuilt meaning. And many asked a question that still echoes today. Why us? That question would lead Hiroshima onto the world stage, where its survivors would no longer remain silent, where memory would become activism, and where the city would reshape the global conversation on war itself. In the years after the bombing, Hiroshima's survivors began to speak. At first it was difficult. Pain was private. Grief was heavy. Many hibakusha believed no one outside the city could truly understand what they had endured. Others feared reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But silence proved heavier than memory. By the early 1950s, survivor organizations formed. They gathered testimonies, documented medical effects, pressured the Japanese government for recognition and healthcare support. They demanded that their suffering not be buried beneath post-war reconstruction. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum opened in 1955. Inside its halls, visitors encountered the physical evidence of the blast. A tricycle belonging to a 3-year-old boy who died that morning. A school uniform burned black by thermal radiation. A lunchbox still holding carbonized rice. Glass bottles melted into unnatural shapes. Photographs lined the walls. Images of survivors taken days after the bombing. Bandaged faces, burned arms, children with vacant eyes. These were not propaganda images. They were raw documentation, visual testimony that words could not fully capture. International visitors arrived. Scientists, journalists, diplomats, activists. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence. Many left changed. Hiroshima became a pilgrimage site, a place where the consequences of modern warfare were no longer theoretical. Every August 6th, ceremonies grew larger. Survivors read peace declarations. Bells rang at 8:15 a.m. Paper lanterns floated down the river, carrying the names of the dead. Silence spread across the crowd. The city's message was simple: never again. Yet globally, nuclear weapons did not disappear. Instead, arsenals expanded. The United States and Soviet Union built thousands of warheads. Hydrogen bombs multiplied destructive power by hundreds of times. Missile silos spread across continents. Submarines carried nuclear fire beneath the oceans. Hiroshima's survivors watched with fear. They had seen what a single bomb could do. Now the world possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization. Some hibakusha traveled abroad. They testified before the United Nations, spoke in classrooms, met political leaders. They showed their scars, described the flash, recounted the screams by the riverbanks. Their bodies became living evidence. Slowly, public consciousness shifted. Nuclear test ban treaties were signed. Arms reduction agreements followed. Though imperfect and fragile, they were shaped in part by the moral weight of Hiroshima's story. Today, the city stands rebuilt. Modern buildings rise where ruins once lay. Trams run again. Children play near the riverbanks. The atomic bomb dome remains, preserved and silent. Survivors grow fewer each year. Their voices weaken with age, but their images remain. Frozen moments of suffering captured on film. Not to shock, not to accuse, but to remind. And that reminder carries forward into the final reflection. Because Hiroshima is not only about destruction, it is about what humanity chooses to learn from it, and whether memory can prevent repetition. Hiroshima does not end with the mushroom cloud. It lingers in the faces of survivors, in the ruins of the city, in photographs that never fade. It lingers in the silence of the rivers, once filled with bodies, now filled with reflection. The atomic bomb was a technical achievement, a demonstration of physics perfected. But its power revealed the deepest vulnerability of humanity, the capacity to destroy at a scale never before imagined. One morning, a city became a laboratory of death. One morning, lives were uncountable, histories erased, families vanished. Yet from the ashes came resilience. Survivors rebuilt, communities returned. The atomic bomb dome remains standing, a skeletal testament to endurance and a warning to the world. Hiroshima transformed suffering into memory, memory into activism, and activism into a moral imperative. The photographs of hibakusha, burned, scarred, staring into lenses, tell a story beyond statistics. They tell of individual suffering, human courage, and the quiet struggle to survive when all rules of warfare were broken. They remind us that technology is not neutral, that power without conscience can annihilate the innocent. Hiroshima became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol that history can teach if we pay attention. That war has limits, not in ability, but in morality. That remembrance is the only shield against repeating the unthinkable. As the city thrives today, as children play where ash once lay, and as the bells ring every August 6th at 8:15 a.m., Hiroshima whispers to the world, look, remember, and choose carefully. The flash that ended one morning continues to illuminate the choices of every generation that follows. History does not forgive ignorance. Hiroshima teaches us that some lessons are written in fire and must never be forgotten.